The wind cut through the morning haze like a knife. It was May 21st, 1940, on the rolling plains south of Arras, France. A gray silence hung over the countryside, the kind that comes only before destruction. Columns of German armor moved relentlessly north, their black crosses gleaming through the mist. The ground trembled beneath the weight of a Panzer division, engines growling like an approaching storm. To the west, a handful of British soldiers waited in shallow ditches, their faces streaked with oil and fear. Then, out of the fog, came a sound, heavy, metallic, deliberate. It wasn't the sharp clatter of the German panzers. It was slower, deeper, like thunder echoing from underground. A Matilda the Sioux infantry tank emerged over a ridge, squat, ungainly, painted in dull green steel. German scouts called it the toy tank for its stubby gun and clumsy tracks. But within minutes, that so-called toy would halt an entire panzer force and force Erwin Rommel himself to change how he fought a war. Because on that cold French morning, steel met willpower, and willpower refused to break. By spring 1940, Europe was on fire. Within weeks, Adolf Hitler's armies had torn through Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium with terrifying speed. No one, not even the most cautious British general, had predicted how quickly the German war machine would move. It was not war as the old men in London remembered it. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war, an unstoppable fusion of tanks, dive bombers, and fast infantry thrusts that broke armies before they could even react. When German panzers surged through the Ardennes forest, terrain the Allies believed impassable to armor, it shattered the illusion of safety. The Maginot Line, the concrete fortress of French defense, had been outflanked. By May 15th, France, been with the strongest army in Europe, was collapsing. Across the Channel, Britain scrambled. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, about 400,000 men, had landed in France months earlier to support their French allies. They were well-trained, disciplined, and loyal, but they were not ready for this war. Their doctrine was rooted in the mud of World War I, slow-moving infantry, deliberate advances, tanks as support weapons, not independent strike forces. To the Germans, that was ancient history. To the British, it was still gospel. And at the heart of that outdated doctrine stood the Matilda Sioux. It was a curious machine. Design began in 1936, long before anyone imagined how fast war would become. Weighing nearly 27 tons, it was built like a rolling fortress, thick armor up to 78 millimeters at the front, nearly impenetrable to most German shells. Its engine, however, was weak, a pair of diesel bus engines laboring under the load. Its top speed barely reached 15 kilometers per hour. To many officers, it was a relic before it ever reached the battlefield. They nicknamed it the Queen of the Battlefield, half in respect, half in irony. Among infantrymen, it was affectionately called the Old Girl. But among critics, even within British command, it was mocked as too slow for offense, too heavy for retreat. Yet inside that slow-moving hulk lay something the British desperately needed: protection. The Matilda's armor could shrug off nearly every German anti-tank weapon of early 1940. Its 2-pounder gun lacked explosive power, but its shells could pierce the thinner armor of German Panzer IIIs and IVs. It was not fast, it was not elegant, but it could survive. And in May 1940, survival was everything. As the German spearheads reached the River Meuse and burst across France, panic spread. The Allies had no answer to the pace of the blitzkrieg. Commanders couldn't coordinate air cover, artillery, or tank units fast enough. Every day the front lines collapsed a little more. British forces retreated northward, closer to the Channel ports. Morale was breaking. Civilians fled in endless columns of carts and bicycles, choking the roads the army needed. In the confusion, entire divisions vanished, surrounded, cut off, or simply gone. By May 20th, German units had reached the coast near Abbeville, cutting the Allied armies in two. Half of Britain's army was now trapped in northern France, with the sea at their backs. They needed time, days, maybe even hours, to regroup, to hold, to find an escape route. So, a desperate idea was born. A counterattack, not to win, but to stall, to strike back just long enough to force the Germans to hesitate. And the weapon chosen for this doomed counterattack was the slow, ridiculed Matilda II. The German advance across France was not a march, it was a storm. By the third week of May 1940, entire Allied armies were collapsing before a weapon no one truly understood: blitzkrieg. It wasn't just tanks, it was tempo, speed as a weapon. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers screamed across the skies, striking bridges, columns, and command posts before enemy lines could even form. Radio-equipped Panzer units raced through the gaps, coordinated by real-time communication, something the Allies still lacked. Infantry followed in motorized convoys, mopping up resistance and clearing the way for the next wave. In every direction, French and British forces were being outflanked before they could even realize they'd been breached. At the center of this offensive stood one man, General Erwin Rommel, commander of the 7th Panzer Division. Nicknamed the Ghost Division, because it moved so fast even German headquarters often lost track of it, Rommel's forces were the embodiment of modern war. In less than 10 days, they had cut across Belgium, smashed through the French Ninth Army, and were racing toward the English Channel. Rommel's tactics were simple yet devastating: relentless pressure, rapid exploitation, and constant communication. He never gave the enemy time to breathe, but with speed came vulnerability. His supply lines stretched thin, his reconnaissance was limited, his tanks, though numerous, were lightly armored compared to what awaited them near Arras. Rommel didn't know it yet, but the British were preparing to strike back. In the crumbling Allied headquarters at Amiens, panic ruled. French generals argued, British officers demanded coordination that no longer existed. Communication lines were gone, bombed, severed, or jammed. The British Expeditionary Force, under Lord Gort, was now fighting for survival, not victory. On the maps, Rommel's division was pushing toward Arras, a small town on the Scarpe River. If it fell, the Germans would split the British retreat in half, isolating tens of thousands of troops from any chance of evacuation. To stop it, the British planned a limited counterattack, small, fast, and utterly desperate. It would be led by Major General Harold Franklin, commanding two mixed British divisions, the 5th and 50th Infantry Divisions. The plan was simple: strike south from Arras and hit Rommel's advancing flank. The goal was not to destroy him, only to delay him. But the force assembled was pitifully small. Barely 74 tanks could be spared. Of these, 58 were Matilda I tanks, tiny machine-gun-armed boxes no match for German armor. Only 16 were Matilda II, the heavy infantry tanks whose armor could deflect almost anything the Germans had. 16 tanks against a panzer division of nearly 300 vehicles. Still, the order stood. The British would attack on May 21st, 1940, supported by 2 infantry battalions and a few batteries of field artillery. French units nearby would try to join in, but coordination was poor, communication worse. As the men prepared, the reality was clear. They were walking into the unknown. Few believed the assault could succeed, not in the traditional sense, but perhaps if they could frighten the Germans, disrupt them, or even make them pause, it might buy time for something greater. Time for evacuation, for survival. Back in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had just taken office days earlier. He was watching the situation in France with growing dread. If the BEF was lost, Britain would stand alone. Every hour mattered now, and every mile the Germans gained brought disaster closer. As night fell on May 20th, the crews of the Matilda tanks prepared their machines. Men wiped the dust from gun sights, checked ammunition belts, and whispered letters home under dim red lights. Many were young, barely out of training, and none had ever faced the enemy in open battle. In the distance, the horizon flickered orange, the reflection of burning towns. Overhead, the throb of German bombers droned endlessly. The men of the BEF knew what was coming. The next morning, they would charge headlong into the spear point of the most powerful army in Europe. And yet, in that hopeless plan lay one of the most remarkable moments of the war, when courage, armor, and sheer defiance forced the German blitzkrieg to stumble. As dawn rose over the French countryside, the toy tanks began to move. The clatter of their treads echoed through the fields, slow but steady. Their engines strained, their crews focused, their commanders grim. The Battle of Arras was about to begin, and with it, the legend of the Matilda tank. In the early morning of May 21st, 1940, inside each Matilda tank, 4 men waited in the cramped dark. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and gun oil. They could barely hear each other over the rumble of twin diesel engines. The commander peered through a narrow slit, his eyes adjusting to the dim French light. In front of him sat the gunner, one hand on the traverse wheel, the other gripping the firing lever. Behind, the loader reached for the heavy 2-pound shells. Solid steel, no explosive filler, each weighing more than a man's fist. There was no room for fear, yet everyone felt it. The claustrophobia was suffocating. The walls were so thick they could barely hear the battle outside. When the first shell hit, even a glancing one, the shockwave rang through their bones like a church bell. For these men, bravery was not loud. It was quiet. A steady voice over the intercom saying, "Target left, range 400, fire." And the recoil, a single heartbeat that kicked through the tank, followed by silence. Then another order, and another. Many of these men had never seen war before this week. They were mechanics, clerks, farmers, now welded into machines of steel. They didn't think of strategy or history. They thought of the man beside them. The commander trusted the gunner trusted the loader, and all of them trusted the armor, because in that moment, the Matilda II wasn't a machine. It was hope with tracks. The plan for the Battle of Arras was simple, perhaps too simple. 2 columns of British armor would push south from Arras, one led by Colonel Harold Fitton, the other by Colonel N.W. Duncan. Their goal, drive a wedge into the German flank, cause confusion, and delay the advance. The terrain was open farmland, ideal for fast tanks, terrible for infantry support. The British tanks would move first, followed by motorized infantry, artillery, and engineers. But the British lacked one thing: speed. The Matilda Bind tanks, armed only with machine guns, were virtually useless against armor. But the Matilda II, though slow, was a fortress. Its thick armor, nearly 3 inches at the front, made it nearly impervious to German 37mm POC anti-tank guns. When the battle began, those guns fired shell after shell, each bouncing off with a dull metallic thud. German soldiers panicked. They'd never seen a tank they couldn't stop. They called for artillery, for air support, for anything that could break the iron beasts. But the British kept coming. Their advance was deliberate, methodical, crushing machine gun nests and tearing through German lines with surgical precision. The irony was brutal. The same slowness that had made the Matilda a subject of ridicule now made it unstoppable. German panzers, built for speed, could not outflank them in the narrow roads and hedgerows around Arras. The toy tank was suddenly rewriting the German rulebook. The Matilda II's strength was not its gun. It was its skin. In 1940, German tanks and anti-tank guns were designed to fight opponents with armor no thicker than 30 millimeters. The Matilda II's frontal plating was more than twice that. Forged in heavy British steel mills, its armor was layered, hardened, and sloped just enough to deflect incoming rounds. At Arras, this design became legend. German 37mm shells shattered harmlessly. Even direct hits from short-barreled Panzer IV guns did little more than dent the surface. Reports from German units later described the scene as firing pebbles at a wall. Inside the tank, crews could hear the clangs of ricochets, the sound like church bells ringing on the hull. Each deflection boosted their confidence, proof that this slow old beast could stand where faster, lighter tanks would have died. Its gun, the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, lacked explosive rounds, a flaw that limited its ability to destroy bunkers or infantry. But against enemy armor, it was deadly precise. At 500 meters, it could pierce any panzer in service. The Matilda's flaws, its speed, its weight, its mechanical strain, all faded in the chaos of Arras. What mattered was survival, and for that, nothing in 1940 could match it. As the morning wore on, the British advance began to look like a miracle. German lines broke. Entire infantry regiments fell back in confusion, and word began to spread through Rommel's division. The English have invincible tanks. But miracles have limits, and soon the German command would unleash a weapon even the Matilda could not ignore. Erwin Rommel had built his career on speed. His 7th Panzer Division was famous for striking fast and hard, disorienting the enemy before they could react. But on May 21, 1940, the Desert Fox to be met something he couldn't outmaneuver. Reports reached his forward command post near Beaurain. British tanks were advancing in force, breaking through German infantry positions. At first, Rommel dismissed it. The British counterattacking? Impossible. Then came the second message, and the third. Entire battalions were being overrun. Anti-tank guns were useless. Shells were bouncing off the enemy armor like stones off a wall. Rommel drove forward in his staff car, ignoring enemy fire, desperate to see the situation for himself. What he found stunned him. British tanks, slow, thick, deliberate, advancing through fields strewn with shattered German guns. His men were retreating in confusion. He ordered every available gun to fire, artillery, mortars, even captured French weapons. Still, the tanks kept coming. Rommel, ever the improviser, did what no one else dared. He called for his 88mm flak guns, the massive anti-aircraft cannons normally used to shoot down bombers. They were hastily redeployed, leveled to the ground, and aimed directly at the Matildas. The next salvo tore through the armor that no field gun could penetrate. The tide began to turn. Rommel himself manned one of the guns at one point, directing fire under intense pressure. Later, he would describe the Arras counterattack as a critical moment. For a few hours, he had believed his entire flank might collapse. But his quick thinking and the terrifying power of the 88mm saved his division from disaster. Still, the lesson stayed with him. Never underestimate an enemy's will to fight. For the German soldiers facing the Matildas, the experience bordered on the supernatural. Many were young, just as their British counterparts were, raised on tales of blitzkrieg invincibility. Until that morning, they had seen every opponent crumble before them. But Arras was different. The first sign of trouble came when anti-tank crews watched their rounds bounce off without effect. The 37mm Pak 36, once considered the pride of the German arsenal, was suddenly useless. Soldiers called it the Heers Anklopf Gerät, the army door knocker. Gun crews fired until their barrels overheated, only to see the British tanks continue moving, crushing their positions beneath heavy tracks. Entire platoons were overrun, their machine guns silenced by short, sharp bursts from the Matilda's 2-pounders. One German survivor later recalled, "We fired at them, but nothing happened. It was like shooting at a wall. They came closer, and closer, and then they were on us." Morale broke fast. Rumors spread through the lines. "They have new armor. They cannot be stopped." Officers struggled to regroup men who had never faced failure before. Only when Rommel's 88mm guns opened fire did the panic ease. Shells the size of a man's arm smashed into the Matildas, finally piercing their armor and stopping them one by one. Even so, the damage was done. For the first time in the campaign, the myth of German invincibility cracked. The British, though few, had fought with a ferocity that left a mark far deeper than the battlefield scars. The Battle of Arras was not a victory, not in maps or medals. By nightfall, the British counterattack had stalled. Rommel's division regrouped. The Matildas that survived limped back north under constant air attack. But in another sense, a quieter, more human one, Arras was a triumph. For days, the Allied armies had known nothing but retreat and collapse. The Germans had seemed unstoppable, their advance mechanical, inevitable. And yet here, in this small corner of northern France, a handful of British tank crews proved that courage and resolve could still alter the rhythm of war. They didn't win. They didn't even survive, most of them. But they made the enemy stop, think, hesitate. And that hesitation would echo. When news of the Arras counterattack reached Hitler's headquarters, it caused alarm. For a brief moment, German command feared a massive Allied breakout. Orders were issued to pause, to consolidate, to reassess. That pause, just a few critical hours, gave the British time to begin what would soon become Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk. The men in those tanks couldn't have known it, but their stand helped save an army, and, indirectly, a nation. Arras was not about victory. It was about defiance, the kind that turns retreat into survival. As the smoke cleared and the battlefield fell silent, the surviving Matildas were dragged back for repairs, their armor dented and scorched, but still intact. The Germans had learned to fear them. The British had learned to trust them. And both sides knew the next encounter would not be the same, because Arras had changed everything. May 21st, 1940, 9 a.m. The fields south of Arras were quiet, mist clinging to the low ridges. Then, from behind a shallow rise near Daneville, came the grinding roar of engines. 16 Matilda II tanks rolled forward in two waves, their guns trained ahead, infantry following behind in trucks and carriers. They moved slowly, painfully slowly, no faster than a man could run. But their advance was steady, deliberate, unstoppable. Each tank commander peered through the slit of his periscope, eyes searching the horizon. Ahead lay the German 7th Panzer Division, stretched thin across open farmland, its units spread out after days of pursuit. They didn't expect a counterattack. They certainly didn't expect this. By 10 a.m., the first German outposts near Beaurains sighted the Matildas emerging from the morning haze. At first, they thought it was French armor retreating north. Then came the first muzzle flashes. A British shell tore through a German machine gun nest, sending men diving for cover. Within minutes, the fields erupted into chaos. German PaK 36 anti-tank crews scrambled to their guns. The first shots rang out, sharp cracks echoing across the plain. Round after round slammed into the Matildas and bounced off. Sparks flew, metal shrieked, but the tanks kept coming. "They're invulnerable," one gunner shouted, his weapon already glowing from the heat. The British formation didn't falter. It simply rolled forward, firing methodically, crushing gun crews under its tracks. Behind them, the Durham light infantry advanced on foot, rifles ready, faces blackened with mud. They followed the tanks through the smoke, taking back ground that had been lost days before. For the first time since the campaign began, the British were advancing. Rommel's division reeled, German radio nets filled with urgent reports. Panzerjäger ineffective, artillery needed, enemy tanks unbreakable. Rommel, miles ahead of his own rear guard, was caught off balance. He had no reserve anti-tank guns in range. His forward infantry was in disarray. As the Matildas thundered south through Beaurains and toward Wiley, German soldiers broke and ran. Rommel's 7th Panzer, the elite of the Blitzkrieg, was being driven backward. He rushed back along the lines, rallying his men personally, pistol in hand. He ordered field guns to lower their barrels, firing point blank at the British tanks. Even that failed. Shells detonated against the armor, leaving only black smears. Then came the moment that stunned both sides. A single Matilda II, leading the left column near Beaurains, pushed too far ahead. It drove straight into a German command post, scattering staff officers and knocking over vehicles. The crew fired as they turned. A shell ripped through Rommel's radio truck, destroying it in a flash. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Erwin Rommel himself was under direct fire from a British tank. He escaped only by sprinting across a ditch, his coat scorched by fragments. His adjutant later recalled, "The general's courage saved us, but we had never seen him so alarmed." By noon, the British tanks had driven nearly 5 miles into the German flank. They had destroyed multiple batteries, captured prisoners, and shattered morale. But their greatest enemy was not the Germans. It was distance. Their infantry lagged behind. Artillery was out of range. And their radios, few and unreliable, couldn't maintain contact. The attack that had begun as a miracle was now running on isolation and exhaustion. German reinforcements began to arrive, engineers, mobile guns, and the first dreaded Flak 88s. The tide was about to shift. Yet, for those few hours, on the fields around Arras, history paused. The unstoppable German Blitzkrieg had met resistance it could not understand. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and in that crack, the British Expeditionary Force found something it had not felt in days: hope. As the afternoon sun rose higher, black smoke drifted across the horizon. Matildas burned beside wrecked panzers, their crews still fighting inside until the last breath. Rommel's counterfire grew heavier. The British lines began to waver. But even as the attack slowed, the message had been sent. to Rommel, to the Wehrmacht, to Berlin itself. The British were not finished. The men who had been written off as defeated had struck back with steel and stubbornness. The toy tank had just rewritten the rules of the war. But the Germans were learning fast. Rommel would not be caught unprepared again. And within the next hour, he would unleash a weapon designed not for tanks, but for the sky. One that would change the battle, and armored warfare itself. The British advance had slowed to a crawl. Smoke blanketed the hills south of Arras, thick as fog, blotting out the sun. Matilda tanks lumbered forward through burning fields, their treads caked with mud and ash. They had driven nearly 5 miles, farther than anyone thought possible, but now the weight of isolation pressed down. No air cover. No artillery, no reserves, just 16 tanks, alone in the open. And then, in the distance, came the sound, a deep, deliberate boom, not the sharp crack of anti-tank fire, but a heavy, chest-shaking concussion. Rommel's answer had arrived. Behind a hedgerow near Beaurain, German engineers had dug in 2 flak 88mm guns, weapons built to destroy aircraft at high altitude, not tanks on the ground. But desperation demanded innovation. Rommel himself directed the crews, ordering them to lower the massive barrels until they pointed horizontally. The first 88mm shell fired at a Matilda tore through its armor as if it were paper. The explosion was catastrophic. Fire burst from the hull, smoke rising in a black column visible for miles. The British formation faltered. The invincible tank had just met its match. Within minutes, more 88s opened fire. Each blast echoed like thunder across the fields, shaking the ground. The range was perfect. 800 meters, 600, then 400. Matilda after Matilda was hit. Some exploded instantly. Others burned slowly, their crews trapped inside, still firing their guns until the ammunition cooked off. In the British command tank, Major Miles, who had led the left column, realized they were being pinned. He ordered a withdrawal, slow, controlled, defensive. But communication was chaos. Radio signals crackled, jammed by interference or lost in the noise of engines and shell fire. The tanks began to reverse one by one under relentless German bombardment. Each movement was agony, a lumbering retreat across open ground, with 80mm shells following like executioners. Rommel, standing on a ridge, watched the counterattack collapse. He later described the moment in his diary. For a time, the situation was extremely serious. Then, gradually, the enemy attack broke down under our fire. But even he knew how close it had come. His division, his entire front, had been on the edge of disaster. If the British had possessed just 20 more tanks or proper coordination, the result might have been very different. Rommel's 88s saved the day and changed the war. From that moment on, every German armored unit understood the value of the Flak 88 as an anti-tank weapon. What began as an improvised defense at Arras would become standard practice, from the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Kursk. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a graveyard of steel. Blackened Matildas lay scattered among the ruins of German gun positions. Smoke curled from hatches. The air reeked of diesel and cordite. The wounded crawled from wreckage, some blinded by smoke, others deafened by explosions. The survivors regrouped north of Arras, where infantry and support units tried to hold a defensive line. They had lost half their tanks, but they had achieved what no one else had managed in weeks. They had made the Wehrmacht stop. For several critical hours, Rommel halted his advance, fearing a much larger Allied counterattack was forming to his south. He called for reinforcements, repositioned his lines, and ordered reconnaissance flights to locate the supposed British armored corps. There was none. The British attack had been a bluff of courage, and it had worked. When night finally fell, the fields of Arras glowed with the faint red of burning machines. Rommel walked the ground himself, inspecting the damage. He found shattered gun emplacements, overturned Panzers, and the hulks of British tanks still smoldering in the dark. He was shaken, not by victory, but by what it had taken to win. He had faced an enemy that refused to collapse, even in the face of annihilation. Later that night, a German officer overheard him mutter, "If they had more like this, we might not have reached the coast." The Battle of Arras ended as quickly as it had begun. By dawn, The surviving British units had withdrawn to regroup north of the Scarpe River. Their counterattack was over, but its impact was only beginning. For while Rommel's division regained its momentum higher up the chain of command, a ripple of caution spread through the German army. Hitler himself, briefed on the ferocity of the British resistance, ordered a temporary halt to the Panzer advance near the Channel coast. That pause, just a few days later, would give the British their narrow window to attempt the impossible: the evacuation of Dunkirk. The toy tank had fallen silent, but in its destruction, it had altered the rhythm of history. The battlefield of Arras, by dawn on May 22, 1940, was a graveyard. British and German soldiers alike moved among the wrecks, silent, stunned, half-deaf from the noise of the previous day. Smoke still hung over the fields, drifting in slow curtains across burned hedgerows and shattered barns. The ground was littered with spent shell casings, broken weapons, and the twisted remains of tanks, both Allied and German. For the British, the cost had been high. Of the 74 tanks that began the counterattack, more than half were destroyed or disabled. Entire crews had perished inside their machines, burned or crushed before they could escape. The Matilda II, once the queen of the battlefield, now lay scattered in pieces across the countryside, its steel skin scorched, but its legend born. Yet the Battle of Arras had achieved what strategy alone could not. It had forced the German war machine to pause. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, though victorious, was shaken. He had lost nearly 400 men killed or wounded, and several dozen vehicles destroyed, more than in any single engagement since crossing the Meuse. His infantry had broken under the shock of the British counterattack. Even his officers, usually confident to the point of arrogance, were unnerved. The Germans had been trained to believe their armor was supreme, fast, precise, invincible. But at Arras, for the first time, they faced an opponent they couldn't outgun or outrun. In the hours after the battle, German field reports painted a picture of uncertainty. The British tanks were heavily armored and impervious to all current weapons. Rommel's command believed the counterattack was merely the tip of a much larger Allied force assembling in the region. That fear, born from 16 Matilda the Sadus, reached all the way to Hitler himself. At the Führer's headquarters in Germany, reports from the front described strong armored resistance near Arras. German high command, worried about potential flank attacks, issued new orders. The Panzer divisions were to slow their advance, consolidate, and await infantry reinforcements. That pause, coming just as British forces were falling back toward the Channel, changed everything. For 2 days, the armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht held their position near Bethune and Saint-Omer, instead of driving directly on Dunkirk. Those 48 hours gave the British Expeditionary Force the narrow window it needed to begin organizing an evacuation. Without Arras, there might never have been a Dunkirk. In the chaos of retreat, word of the counterattack spread among the British ranks. Men who had been retreating nonstop for weeks now spoke of the Arras tanks that had taken on the Germans and lived. It became a story, half rumor, half inspiration, retold in trenches, transport trucks, and refugee columns. It reminded them that the enemy could bleed. In London, reports reached Winston Churchill, who had only been Prime Minister for 10 days. He read the dispatches with grim satisfaction. The counterattack hadn't turned the tide, but it had proven something vital. The British Army could still fight. It could still surprise the Germans. It could still matter. Churchill later described Arras as a magnificent episode, a stand of bravery that showed the steel of our men and machines. To the Germans, it was a lesson learned in shock. After Arras, they never again underestimated the importance of heavy armor. The Flak 88 was formally adopted as a standard anti-tank weapon. Tactics were revised, doctrines rewritten, and even tank designs modified to increase gunpowder and penetration. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The aura of invincibility that had followed the German blitzkrieg was cracked, not broken, but visibly fractured. If 16 slow tanks could cause this much disruption, what might a truly prepared army do? That question lingered, even as the German advance resumed days later. By the time the BEF reached the beaches of Dunkirk, the men who had fought at Arras were exhausted, many without tanks or vehicles. They had bought time, nothing more. but time was everything. As naval ships began the evacuation, the survivors of the toy tanks stood among the lines of soldiers waiting for rescue, soot-streaked, silent, and hollow-eyed. They had faced the storm, and for one day held it back. The battle was over, but its shadow stretched across the Channel, toward Dunkirk, toward London, toward the future of the entire war. Though slow and limited, its armor had shown the Allies what true survivability meant, that a tank's greatest weapon was not its gun, but its ability to stay alive under fire. In the chaotic months that followed the evacuation at Dunkirk, as Britain prepared for invasion, designers and strategists studied every report that came from Arras. Every shell strike, every penetration, every crew testimony was examined in detail. They learned that speed without armor was suicide, that coordination between infantry armor and air power was not optional. It was the heartbeat of modern war, and they learned that courage could buy time where strategy could not. The British Armored Corps began rethinking everything, from the balance between firepower and protection to the role of tanks in offense versus defense. New designs began to take shape. Faster, stronger, better armed machines like the Churchill, the Cromwell, and eventually the Comet. Each of them owed something to the battered Matilda that had stood its ground at Arras, yet the Matilda itself wasn't done. Despite its losses in France, production continued. By 1941, more than 2,900 Matilda the Qs had been built. They went on to serve in North Africa, where their thick armor again proved decisive against Italian forces during Operation Compass. In the deserts around Bardia, Tobruk, and El Alamein, the queen of the battlefield once again lived up to her name. German shells still struggled to pierce her armor, until, ironically, they used the very weapon learned from Arras, the 88 mm. By the time Rommel and the Afrika Korps arrived in North Africa, the duel had come full circle. The tank that had once terrified Rommel now faced his guns again, this time under the blazing desert sun. The Matilda's days as a frontline weapon were numbered, not because it had failed, but because the war had evolved beyond it. Speed and range became the new gods of battle. Heavy armor, once a shield, now risked becoming a coffin in the vast open deserts. Still, veterans of Arras and Tobruk remembered her with respect. She was slow, but she was faithful. She was crude, but she saved lives. In Germany, the shock of Arras also left its mark. Rommel's reports on the engagement were studied by Hitler's armored theorists. They concluded that future German tanks needed bigger guns and heavier armor, leading, within 2 years, to the development of the Tiger of Vprs, and its main weapon, the same 80mm gun first turned against the Matildas outside Arras. A strange symmetry, the tank that forced the enemy to invent the weapon that would one day destroy it. Among Allied soldiers, Arras became legend, not for victory, but for defiance. When the British Expeditionary Force returned to France 4 years later, on D-Day, veterans of 1940 spoke quietly of the Arras tanks, those 16 Matildas that had once faced an army and lived to tell the tale. It was a story that embodied the stubborn resilience of the British war effort itself. Even when outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, we stood. Historians would later call the Battle of Arras a tactical defeat, but a strategic miracle. It bought perhaps 2 days of time, but those 2 days gave birth to Dunkirk, the moment that allowed Britain to survive long enough to fight another day. By 1945, when the war finally ended, the Matilda was long retired, obsolete by every technical measure, but her spirit lived on in every tank that followed. The lessons of armor, teamwork, and endurance learned at Arras were woven into the very DNA of Allied warfare. And when peace returned, the name Matilda remained a symbol, not of power, but of endurance. The Matilda's last surviving examples now rest in museums, silent, massive, their paint faded by time. Visitors touch the armor and read the small plaques beside them, unaware that this humble, slow-moving machine once made history tremble. Because in 1940, when all of Europe was falling, she, and the men inside her, refused to. Arras had ended in smoke and ruin, but through that smoke came the faint light of something larger. The beginning of Allied resistance. The first spark of the long road back to victory. The Matilda had been called a toy, but toys don't change wars. This one did. War has a way of magnifying everything, Courage, fear, arrogance, and resolve. At Arras, all of these collided in one day of thunder and fire. It wasn't a grand victory. There were no parades, no triumphant speeches, no flags raised over cities, just burned fields, wrecked machines, and exhausted men. But in those fields lay the proof that even when all logic points to defeat, willpower can still bend history. 16 British tanks, slow, outdated, undersupplied, had stood against the finest armored division in the world. They didn't break the German line, but they did something far greater. They made it hesitate. And hesitation, in war, can mean survival. The Matilda II, the tank that many had dismissed as a mistake, became a symbol of that survival, of the stubborn defiance that defines nations under siege. It was not beautiful, it was not fast, but it endured. And through its endurance, it reminded the world that even steel has spirit when men believe in what it carries. Rommel would go on to become one of the most famous generals of the war. His 88mm guns would dominate future battlefields. But deep down, even he never forgot Arras, the day when, for a few uncertain hours, he saw his unstoppable army stop. When we look at the rusting remains of a Matilda II today, its armor pitted, its guns silent, we see more than a relic. We see the echo of every soldier who climbed inside, knowing he might never climb out. We see the proof that resistance, no matter how brief, matters. Arras did not win a battle. It bought a future. And in that quiet victory, born from courage, from steel, and from something that should never have worked, the world found its first glimmer of hope in a dark, collapsing Europe. Because sometimes, it only takes a toy to remind the world that even giants can bleed.